Hello, I'm Morgan Pekma, and this is City and State TV. Today, our guest is the Republican nominee for Attorney General of the state of New York, John Cahill. Mr. Cahill, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Morgan. Good to be here.
So tell us, why are you running for Attorney General?
Well, Morgan, I spent some time in government, 12 years with Governor Pataki, and I really appreciate the value and the importance of public service, first of all. But also, when I look at the role of the Attorney General and the position that has in the state, I am frustrated by the sense that it's really been used not so much to be the people's advocate, to be the people's lawyer, to stand up for the rights of everyday New Yorkers, but really nothing more than a political stepping stone. And when we see the office used for political purposes as opposed to the people's interest, that undermines the integrity of that office. So, one of the primary reasons I'm running is to be the people's lawyer, to be the people's advocate, not aspiring for higher office or any other office. I think it's good to have ambition, but we should find ways to have ambition within the office of the Attorney General. So that first and foremost is really the reason I'm running, is really to change the nature and the character of the Attorney General.
Do you believe that Attorney General Schneiderman has used his office for political purposes?
I think that there's been a long track history now of using that office to ascend to a higher office. And when that happens, people question the reasons why you bring certain actions on behalf of the people of the state of New York. I think to be an effective Attorney General, you have to commit that you're not going to run from higher office from that office. And until you have that, until you have people willing to make that commitment, it's always going to be subject to second guessing as to whether the actions you take on behalf of the people of the state of New York are for your political interest or for the interest of the people of the state of New York.
Another way that people have perceived the Office of Attorney General in the last couple administrations was as the Sheriff of Wall Street. And in your announcement, you referred to the Wolves of Wall Street. Do you intend to take up that mantle of regulation of Wall Street if you are elected?
Oh, certainly the Attorney General does have a role to play with respect to the oversight of the financial service industry through the Martin Act, which is a very powerful tool to hold the financial sector accountable. What I would not do is use that office and use the powers under the Martin Act for political purposes. I think it's important. We constantly see the need for diligence and for regulation of the financial service industry. That's important, but we also have to understand that that is also one of the most important components of the city and the state economy. We need to be fair to that industry. We need to regulate them, but we can't use that officer, that sector, and use the power of the Attorney General basically to force jobs out of New York State and treat them at times inappropriately.
Do you think that the government has been overly harsh in its dealings with Wall Street?
No, well, I'm not drawing judgment on any, certainly there have been real problems down on Wall Street. But one of the issues that I really was concerned about was the JP Morgan settlement, where the Attorney General decided that he wanted to spend that settlement as he saw fit. Well, if you're a lawyer and you're representing clients, as he is, we're his client as the people of the state of New York, the lawyer shouldn't be the one deciding how to spend that money. It's not restitution to the victims. It's basically, he wanted it in the sole discretion of the Attorney General. I think that's wrong. I think that the monies that were received in that settlement should be decided by the people of the state of New York, not by the lawyer of the people of the state of New York.
You got into this race relatively late. It was in May. What was your reluctance to jump in earlier, and is that a reflection upon the uphill battle that Republicans face running for statewide office?
No, not at all, actually. I mean, frankly, if there's anything else, I would have gotten in earlier if I was concerned about the uphill battle. And it is, it's going to be a tough race, a challenging race, but I'm confident in the race, Morgan. But really the reason why it took until May is that I've enjoyed life in the private sector. I've had a successful business. I enjoy practicing law in the private sector. It's been great to be able to spend time with my family, et cetera. So I was never really one looking to get into politics, if you would. My career in government really has been on the governmental side, not on the political side. But when I saw this vacuum, when I saw certain things unfold here in the city and the state about the direction of the state, I thought I had the background and the experience really to bring value to the political process. So it wasn't, if you would, the challenges of the race, but my own, personal decision where I was in my life before I decided, this is something that I want to do now. I think it's the right time. I think we need to compete for ideas for the future of the state, and that's why I decided to get in.
You were secretary to Governor Pataki. He's also your business partner. What are the lessons of governance that you have taken away from him that you would apply to your work as Attorney General?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Governor Pataki, had a really unique governing skill. He was a very serious listener, and he had core philosophical beliefs, but he also understood in order to govern, and you had to be pragmatic and you had to listen to all sides. And I think that's what made him an effective governor for 12 years. And I think I learned an awful lot from seeing that and seeing him being successful as a governor. I'd like to think I would bring some of the same traits to the Attorney General's office.
We've seen a very complicated dynamic between Attorney General Schneiderman and Governor Cuomo. At times it seemed that Governor Cuomo perhaps even deliberately undercutting the authority of the office of Attorney General. Do you think that's an accurate appraisal of it?
You know, I haven't really followed, if you would, in great interest the 4 years of them serving together. But I will say this, listen, the Attorney General has an important role representing the executive in litigation, in policy development, and we worked both with Attorney General Vacco and Spitzer in that regards. And even though, particularly Attorney General Spitzer was far from a different philosophical, politically than Governor Pataki, we did find ways to basically push the state's agenda, and I think that's important. The Attorney General has to understand his role as being a lawyer for the people of the state of New York, representing the executive, and the executive is the executive running basically the state agencies. And I think if there's an understanding of the responsibilities and roles of both of those offices, I think it can work very smoothly.
City and State has reported upon the Moreland Commission extensively about the governor's office perhaps overstepping its bounds or impugning the independence of the commission. Do you think that Attorney General Schneiderman did enough to protect the independence of the commission, and how would you have done things differently?
Well,
perhaps?
I think I would have gone back before the creation of the commission. And certainly if we had somebody in Albany who was really serving as the watchdog for the people of the state of New York and preserving the integrity of state government, we wouldn't have had a need for the Moreland Commission. The fact is that there was an enormous vacuum in Albany being filled, unfortunately, by the U.S. Attorney's Office as opposed to being filled by someone in state office, and that led to the creation of the Moreland Commission. And yes, the Moreland Commission, I think everybody would say, well, what did it produce? And it didn't produce what people had hoped for. And as the Attorney General was, if you would, co-leader of the Moreland Commission, you can't help but say that it didn't result in any significant changes in the way that Albany does business. But there is still an opportunity for that office to step up, to use its powers, particularly through the Charities Bureau, to enforce the law and hold people accountable in Albany that are using their political offices, not for the people's interest, but for their own personal interest.
In Albany, obviously, we have a pestilence of corruption.
Mm-hmm.
What would you do to tackle political corruption in Albany?
Yeah, certainly I would make it a top priority of the Attorney General's office. And it's fair to say the Attorney General doesn't have all the powers it should have in fighting corruption, but it does have powers to bring accountability to government. And as I was just mentioning, the issue of charities. How many times have we seen legislators fund their charities, and these charities are nothing more than a front for their political operations or their personal family jobs, patronage. There's a lot more that needs to be done on that issue through the Attorney General's office, not just in Albany, but around localities around the state, Morgan. I think that's a critical issue that the Attorney General should be doing much more at.
How would you seek to expand the powers of the Attorney General?
Well, right now the issue of having, broad powers on corruption in Albany, a lot of that rests with the Board of Election. And I think that those issues should be really looked at and say, has that been effective? And can the Attorney General play a more effective role in enforcing political corruption than we now have?
Different attorney generals have kind of created their own purviews in the office. And you spoke in your announcement a great deal about hydrofracking. You are the former commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation. First, how is your work at DEC? How did that lead you to having this strong affinity for hydrofracking or support for hydrofracking, I should say? And how would you try to bring hydrofracking, or how would you seek to legalize hydrofracking in New York State through your work as Attorney General?
I mean, I'm very proud of the work that I did at DEC, and then, in the environment, preserving 1 million acres of open space. One of the first things I worked on in that office, Morgan, was the New York City watershed. And I'm very proud of the work that Governor Pataki and I played a role in that. So I understand the importance of protection of our water quality, and we can't allow any threat to the New York City water supply. But that doesn't mean there are regions in the state that we cannot and should not pursue the development of our natural resource, particularly natural gas along the southern tier. Having led that department for over 4 years, I know the capabilities of that agency to regulate pretty complex industries throughout the state. We do it now. We do it with radioactive material throughout the state. We do it with heavy industries throughout the state. There are very capable people in that department if you give them the proper regulatory structure and the proper financing to basically oversee the regulatory process. And I am very confident that if we look at hydrofracking and we exclude the New York City watershed, we should never take zero chance with our precious water. We exclude any of our state parks. We require the industry to disclose what's being used, and we push a strong regulatory agenda. We can do it, and we can do it safely, Morgan. And I think that my experience at DEC has shown me that when you have, if you want economic growth and environmental sustainability, you need to move forward on both. And I think that natural gas in the southern tier along the Pennsylvania border can be a real boon to the economy of upstate New York, not just for the development of the shale resources along the southern tier, but when you think about clean, affordable natural gas right here in New York, what that would mean to our manufacturing in places like Rome and Utica and Syracuse, places where serious manufacturing has left over the past decades. That could be a real start for economic growth in those regions of the state.
We're here in Lower Manhattan overlooking the World Trade Center. You were the development chief of Lower Manhattan for Governor Pataki. Were you ever frustrated with the pace of the redevelopment here at the World Trade Center? I mean, is that a fair criticism?
Well, I wouldn't say it's the pace is an extraordinarily difficult process. And I think there was a sense at times, of course, we wanted to move faster, but always, we wanted to get it right. And when you go look out there now, Morgan, I take enormous pride in seeing what has happened, from the Freedom Tower to the Memorial to the museum. You see the other office buildings rising. And so when you look at the scale of what had to get done and trying to build around those 16 acres and keep the trains running, keep the commuters moving back and forth to the path, keeping the residents and the businesses, vibrant down here, and really changing the whole makeup of Lower Manhattan. I'm very, very proud to have been part of that. I look at the Freedom Tower and I look at the Memorial and the museum, and what a statement it is for our city and for our country to have rebuilt the way we have. I'm very proud of it.
And lastly, to get into some of the dreaded horse race side of your race, I mean, the AG has $6 million at least in the bank. He's already made a massive ad buy. You got a late start to fundraising. What do you see as your path to victory, and what would you say to detractors who say that you don't have the money to make a viable challenge?
The path to victory is being a voice for all New Yorkers. And it's being out there, it's working hard, it's talking to people in Brooklyn and to Buffalo. And how does the Attorney General's office, has it made an impact in your life in the last 4 years? And if the answer is you don't know him, you haven't heard of him, well, maybe you need to get a new lawyer. And I think that that message about having a better New York, having somebody who's really willing to fight for the working people of the state that go to work every day and looking for an advocate in Albany, I think that's a pretty powerful message. And so whether it's the donors or the voters, I got 6 months. I'm going to run really hard for 6 months, Morgan, and I'm pretty confident that with the right message, I'm going to be successful. I wouldn't have done it otherwise.
John Cahill, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Morgan.